Welcome to part 2 of the presentation on principles of justice and ethics. In part 1, we looked at the following principles of justice and ethics: the Golden Rule, Jesus' second great commandment, traditional utilitarianism, and negative utilitarianism. Now, in this part 2 segment, we're going to be looking at Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, the first and second formulations, then also John Rawls' theory of justice and Robert Nozick's Entitlement Theory, which tracks fairly well with the whole political movement known as libertarianism. We began with a categorical imperative. As I emphasized in the Introduction to Business Ethics, Kant has had an outsized impact on rights-based theories because of his categorical imperative concept. In his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, he basically set forth an argument that it was possible to deduce a moral imperative, the categorical imperative, from human rationality. Now, the first formulation emphasizes the way in which universalization plays into Kant's theory. And as I indicated before, Kant believed that the kernel of immorality that lies within all of us is the tendency to exclude ourselves from the normal rules that everyone else needs to obey. First formulation goes like this: act only on that maxim or subjective principles through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So if I am thinking about doing such and such, and I ask myself, okay, well, what would happen if everyone did that? Would I be okay with that outcome? Or does that indicate that there is something awry in my reasoning here if I can't allow my actions to be universalized in that manner? Now, the second formulation I actually find to be more powerful than the first, and it goes like this: act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but also always at the same time as an end. So never simply as a means, but treating people as ends in themselves. This is an incredibly powerful notion that goes directly to this understanding of human dignity and the need to respect the rational choice of others. It has an incredible import for marketing ethics for obvious reasons, because it is so easy for marketing to devolve from persuasion to manipulation, and manipulation would not be a legitimate way of trying to sell products and goods and services from a Kantian perspective, because it would compromise the ability of people to be their own intelligent decision makers. Now, the key concept of behind this principle is that it requires people to evaluate their actions in a universal context, that is, first formulation, and to respect the inherent dignity of others as rational beings, that being the second formulation. As you might imagine, there are interpretive issues with the categorical imperative that I want to draw to your attention. One of these has to do with the problem associated with the first formulation of universalization of the categorical imperative, and that has to do with possible conflicts between primary obligations. Kant believes, for example, that it is impermissible to lie because the act of a lie cannot be universalized, because if you knew that somebody was going to constantly lie and misrepresent themselves in conversation with you, why would you ever talk to them? That would seem to undermine the very purpose of having a conversation in the first place. But what about this context? Let's say you have a knock on the door and you are harboring Jews in your attic of your house. And the person who is knocking is an SS soldier who is looking for Jews to apprehend, to send them to Auschwitz and Dachau and other camps, and they will lose their lives. Are you going to lie to the SS soldier and lie well? Most people, thankfully, would say yes, they would lie in order to protect the people under their care and preserve their lives. This makes common sense to most people, but it is not something that can be easily comprehended within the categorical imperative. The only workaround would be to say, okay, imagine this situation where we have the SS soldier at the door, and then I have to determine, am I going to tell the truth or lie in that situation in order to preserve life? In that situation, can I universalize this so that everyone else who has that exact same experience would know that lying in this case would be correct, because it would be a way to universally uphold the right to save lives, even though that might involve doing something wrong like lying to the SS soldier. But it doesn't seem that workaround is truly does justice to the categorical imperative. It's not something that Kant himself would have embraced. So I tend to think this is a big problem with formulation 1 of the categorical imperative. Now, formulation 2, I think you are really hard pressed to find problems with this. It is such a airtight, wonderfully put concept to treat people never simply as means, but also as ends in themselves. The only problem, though, that I could point out would be, what about certain occupations where it seems that we may be treating them solely as a means and not as ends in themselves? An example would be postal carriers or waiters and waitresses. Are these individuals being treated as a means to just get mail or to order dinner, or are they also being treated as ends in themselves? Now, my bias is to think, okay, with postal carriers, there used to be a very strong tradition in the United States of giving postal carriers Christmas gifts, for example, which I think is something that people really should think about doing, because it's a way to recognize their contribution to our lives. And I have some postal carriers who are immediate members of our family, and I know that means a great deal to them. So that kind of idea of recognizing people once a year or in small ways is actually a really great thing to do, that I think resolves the problem of treating somebody simply as a means and as opposed to an end in themselves. Similarly, being gracious and kind to waiters and waitresses in restaurants obviously is an important way to recognize them. What makes this a little bit more ambiguous with waiters and waitresses is tipping. Tipping is really should be considered sort of mandatory behavior unless something has gone like horribly, horribly wrong. But the idea of doing, say, less than a 20% tip seems to be really not the right way to go in American culture today. Although there are other cultures, many European cultures, for example, where there is no habit of tipping whatsoever. So this is kind of more a matter of cultural expectation than anything else. So maybe going above and beyond 20% in a tip would be a way to show appreciation in a context like that to a waiter or waitress. But more likely than not, the idea would be to simply be respectful of people and kind and aware of them as individual decision makers themselves, and having some sense of connection with them, as opposed to simply treating them as a means to get your dinner. So I think those problems with the second formulation are not important, don't rise to the level of importance as much as the conflict of primary obligations with the first formulation. Now we turn to a very influential framework for thinking about justice that originated with John Rawls, pictured here, the late John Rawls, who taught at Harvard University, who published an article in 1958 called Justice as Fairness that foreshadowed many of the concerns and issues that he used in the development of the theory of justice that was published in 1971. And this book, The Theory of Justice, has had an incalculably important impact on people's thinking about justice, particularly from a cross-cultural standpoint. There have been many, many books written on this one single book and tens and thousands of academic articles on Rawls' theory of justice. Well, Rawls' theory of justice relies on two principles of justice. The first principle is that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with a similar liberty for others. Basically, this is the idea that I should be able to exercise my freedom in society as long as the exercise of my freedom does not actually take away the freedom or prerogative or rights of other individuals. So I'm not free to walk up to somebody and punch them in the nose, but I am free to have ideas and to express those ideas that might be offensive to another person, but that's their problem. I can't constrain my freedom because of my concerns about, will this person think well of me? Are they going to be disturbed by my ideas, et cetera, et cetera? Now, this doesn't apply, of course, to yelling fire in a crowded theater or hate speech, but you get the idea that basically a good society, according to Rawls, will respect a maximum degree of expression of individual freedom. Now, the second principle is this: social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both A, reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, and B, attached to positions and offices open to all. Now, this second principle is a bit complex. The B clause is referring to the notion of equality of access, to say that anyone should be able to have any office in society unless there are some really compelling reasons why you would want to make a restriction. For example, an age restriction of 35 years old for the President of the United States, but of course not a gender restriction. Or what about the use of allowing women to play combat roles, like combat pilots, for example, or frontline personnel in the infantry? Are those is that kind of access mandated by the second principle of justice? Yes, no doubt about it. In other words, there shouldn't be any restrictions of that would keep people, because of their gender or racial background or religious beliefs, to keep them blocked off from certain kinds of positions and offices. The first clause Rawls refers to as the difference principle. And basically the idea of the difference principle is that you're going to have economic inequality in any market economy. That's just a baseline fact on the ground. However, those inequalities should operate so that they benefit everyone, or as Rawls puts it in other formulations of the difference principle, they would benefit the least advantaged representative man, the lowest person on the economic totem pole. And so the difference principles would say inequality is fine, but that person who is at the lowest on the lowest on the economic totem pole should actually benefit from this degree of inequality. In some formulations of the difference principle, we have more of a trickle-down idea of the difference principle. In others, it is more strongly stated that the position of the least advantaged representative man would be maximized by those degree of inequalities. So from this standpoint, Bill Gates, fabulously wealthy, who uses his money well, as Bill and Melinda Gates have in their foundation work, easily could justify, according to the difference principles, this tremendous inequality of wealth because of the good that has taken place for the least advantaged representative person. And one thinks, for example, of their worldwide campaign against malaria as being deeply influential in terms of bettering the prospects of those who suffer around the world. Now, the key idea with Rawls' theory is this. The theory, with its original position, provides a cross-cultural blueprint for thinking about justice across societies and how societies can become more just in their institutions and practices. Now, there are a number of interesting interpretational facets of Rawls' theory that I'd like to go ahead and briefly introduce you to. One of these has to do with this very interesting concept of the original position and how another concept relates to that, which Rawls calls the veil of ignorance. Excuse me. Rawls basically starts with this thought experiment. Imagine that you're sitting around the table in a room with 7 or 8 other individuals, and you are tasked in this setting to invent a society from scratch. You will determine whether it has a system of government that allows for political freedom or whether it's a dictatorship. If it's a democracy, all right, will there be religious freedom? Will there be a means of public education? Will there be a safety net in this society that would allow for old age insurance like Social Security? Will there be welfare programs available to people? Will this be a society that will preserve religious freedom? A host of all kinds of concerns and issues you're going to determine with your other colleagues around the table in the original position. The key is that you do not know where you will end up in this society that you've created. That would be the veil of ignorance. All that you know is that once you have created this society and walk out the door, you are going to be randomly placed in that society. And what strikes me as incredibly powerful about this theory is that it models the arbitrary experience of birth. None of us as human beings choose our birth. And yet the arbitrary fact that we are born to a set of parents in a particular country is going to have an outsized impact on our future economic prospects. So this, I think, captures well the outsized way that birth functions in terms of providing people with life opportunities that they would not have if they had been born in a different context. One of the things that Rawls tries to do in his theory is to present a compelling alternative to utilitarianism. And in doing so, he blends the social contract position of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau with a ethical tradition known as intuitionism that springs from a philosopher that was very significant at the turn of the 20th century, G.E. Moore. Intuitionism has the belief that all individuals have within them a kind of a conscience that allows them to know what is right or wrong. And so Rawls blends in the original position the social contract idea with intuitionism to create this kind of decision context that creates a moral point of view for determining whether a society is going to be just or not. Now, his belief is that the original position, decision makers, will affirm a social ordering of the society that they create that roughly coincides with the two principles of justice, the first and second principle. And so that's how he justifies the notion of how we can derive these two principles of justice from the original position. There is, however, an important question that has been raised, and that is, if you were sitting around the table as one of the participants in the original position, would you decide to orient a society that maximized the position of the least advantaged representative person on the premise that you're going to be risk adverse? You're not going to want to be that person, but if you are that person, you're going to want to be in the best possible situation that you can be? Or would you be more inclined to play the odds and maximize the average? That is, to create a society maybe that had a very large middle class, which is likely probability, from a probability standpoint, the group that you're going to belong to, as opposed to focusing on the lower end of the totem pole. This is an interesting question. Are they going to maximize the minimum or use the minimax criteria, or maximize the average? I think it could be said that rationality could well dictate maximizing the average. However, Rawls would come back and say, okay, as a mathematical probabilistic concept, yes, maybe maximizing the average would make sense if the stakes were not so high. But you are aware of the potential that you could become that least advantaged representative man. Would you not, in a situation like that, operate in a more risk-adverse framework? And I think that there is really something to Rawls's contention here, that given the sense of loss that we could likely experience as we walk out the door and are randomly placed in society, we're going to want to avoid that worst case scenario. Now, one of Rawls's colleagues at Harvard, Robert Nozick, was so impressed by Rawls' theory of justice that he decided to take a sabbatical in order to write a book that would further elaborate and support Rawls' theory of justice. And remarkably, halfway through his research, he concluded that he could not agree with many of the things that Rawls said in his book, and offered an alternative framework, which he refers to as an entitlement theory, in 1974 in a book called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And basically, Nozick's critique of Rawls went like this. Rawls' theory looks at justice from a time slice perspective, in that, okay, we have the original position, we have the two principles of justice. Let's now take a snapshot of society and determine the degree to which the economic distribution in that society comports with the two principles of justice. Is that society and distribution consistent with the two principles of justice, or do we need to make changes to bring the economic distribution more in line with, say, Rawls' difference principle, for example? Nozick says, hold it. That is not a realistic way of thinking about an economic distribution, because economic distributions just simply don't appear overnight. They are the result of historical processes that involve good luck, bad luck, initiative and hard work, technological development, a host of factors that cannot be so easily understood apart from the historical processes that brought those economic distributions about. So he argues for what he terms a historical approach, whereby principles of justice are not used in this time slice framework, but rather to govern historical processes. So if we have the principles of justice as historical principles respected in an economic distribution, the outcome will be just, necessarily, according to Nozick, as a result of adhering to those historical principles of justice. And he identifies two basic historical principles of justice and then a principle of rectification that is a corrective of violations of the first two principles. First, the principle of justice and acquisition. You are free to acquire anything as long as your activities do not diminish the existing entitlements of other persons. This is more like a Lockean, John Locke approach to understanding mixing your labor with nature, creating private property is okay as long as you're not doing things like damming up a river to irrigate your land and then leaving your neighbor who is downstream with no water whatsoever. That would obviously be an inappropriate application of the principle of justice and acquisition. The second principle of justice is the principle of justice and transfer. All transfers of resources must be voluntary. That is, no physical coercion is permitted. I can't have a gun to your head and say, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse. All trade and exchanges must be done voluntarily. And then finally, he adds a principle of rectification, in that violations of the principle of justice and acquisition and the principle of justice and transfer must be rectified. So if you have historic violations, they need to be rectified so as to bring us back to a kind of a state of equilibrium, if you will, before those violations of the principle of justice and acquisition and the principle of justice and transfer. The key concept behind this theory is that it emphasizes the importance of safeguarding freedom from restraint. This is sometimes referred to as negative freedom, freedom from restraint in crafting just societies. So basically, Nozick's theory emphasizes the importance of personal liberty, of being able to choose to exercise freedom, and hence this theory is a very powerful theoretical statement on behalf of libertarianism. Now, there are some interesting interpretive issues with Nozick's theory that I'd like to elaborate on. We've already talked about the historical versus the time slice principles of justice. But one of the interesting things about the principle of rectification is this question: is there a generational statute of limitations on the principle of rectification? Nozick's theory has often been taken to argue for a very limited role of government, which would be consistent with political libertarianism. But what if we have some massive violation of the principle of justice and acquisition, like, for instance, displacing Native Americans in the development of the United States, pushing them into lands that were more unproductive and basically destroying their culture by isolating them from large regions, large stretches of the prairie lands within the United States. That's a big problem, obviously, because that has had such a tremendous impact negatively on Native American societies. And in fact, the group that has the highest suicide rate in the United States are Native American young people living on reservations in the United States. This is like a giant, huge problem. What do we do with African Americans who were taken to the United States against their will as slaves, and then with the Civil War still, even though slavery ended, still kept underfoot, if you will, through sharecropper arrangements, Jim Crow laws, denied the kind of equal access to the legal system that white Americans had. What do we owe them in terms of trying to rectify these past injustices? What about Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II in so-called friendly or maybe comfortable concentration camps in the United States? Basically, their loyalty to the United States was subject to question because they were Japanese. They were looked different than the rest of us, as opposed to German Americans or Italian Americans were never hoarded into, gathered up and isolated into concentration camps to keep them away from doing anything untoward to the United States because of their loyalty to their homeland. But we did this with the Japanese Americans. What do we owe them for disrupting their lives in this way during World War II? Again, a really important question. If you have a broad understanding of the principle of rectification, one could understand a greater role for government intervention in trying to right those past wrongs than if you have a more narrow, time-sensitive understanding of the principle of rectification. Now, Nozick offers in his book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, three illustrations to illustrate his, three examples to illustrate his understanding of the entitlement theory. They are Wilt Chamberlain, the chemist, and the concept of voluntary slavery. We start with Wilt Chamberlain. From a time slice standpoint, if you look at what professional athletes like Wilt Chamberlain, or just substitute your favorite athlete for him in this context, if you look at what professional athletes are paid, it's really, really hard to justify that from a time slice standpoint. Like, why should somebody be paid so much to play a game that they love when other people that are performing much more beneficial social services like teachers and childcare workers and others, why shouldn't they be paid more as opposed to these professional athletes? Well, Nozick would say, okay, time slice approach, I see your point, but think about this from a historical principle. From a historical principle, basically, we have fans of Wilt Chamberlain who are willing to voluntarily part with their money to see Wilt Chamberlain work his magic on the basketball court. And so why shouldn't he get the hard-earned dollars that are offered up voluntarily by his fans? Would you want the owner of the venue to have that money because they're not going there just to be sitting in this particular stadium? They're going there to see Wilt Chamberlain. Would it be the ticket scalpers that you would want to benefit by keeping the price of admission low so that then they become the beneficiaries of this, buying up groups of tickets and then reselling them at a higher price? Obviously, you wouldn't want that. Is it the owner of the basketball team that you would want to benefit, to economically benefit from this, and not Wilt Chamberlain? Again, that makes no sense. So basically, you're drawn to the conclusion, yeah, from a historical standpoint, it makes sense that Wilt Chamberlain is able to be fabulously rich because people want to see him play and work his magic on the basketball court. Let's look at a second example that he talks about involving a chemist who spends 20 years of his life trying to find the cure for a disease that impacts 50,000 people in the United States, impacts them in terms of people dying as a result of this particular disease. And over this 20-year period of research, he finds a cure for this dread disease. The cure can be administered through 3 pills that are taken over a 3-month period. And so now that he has found the cure and fast-tracked the approval through the Food and Drug Administration, the chemist wonders, what should I price this at? So he hires an economist to give him a profit maximizing price, and she comes back with a price that would say that each of the tablets of the 3 tablets should cost $200,000. So the effect of this is that the cure will cost somebody $600,000. Now, assume for the moment that there is no public insurance available and there is no charitable operation that is going to subsidize the cost of this drug. Let's say at the price point of $200,000 per pill, it was determined by the economist that only 20,000 of 50,000 people who are subject to this disease or suffering from this disease will have enough resources to actually get the cure. The other 30,000 people will die. Now, from a time slice perspective, this situation seems very problematic. I mean, 50,000 people's lives could be saved if the chemist did not adopt the profit maximizing price of $200,000 per pill, $600,000 for the entire treatment. Why not drop the price and allow more people to experience life and be cured from this dread disease? Nozick would argue that the chemist is well within his rights not to be concerned with the 30,000 people who died, because there are 20,000 people who otherwise would have died that he has saved. So yes, 30,000 people will die, but if he hadn't come along, there would have been 50,000 people who would have died. So he sees this as a legitimate kind of decision to adopt the profit maximizing price, despite the fact that 30,000 people will die. And this raises some interesting questions about the principle of justice in transfer. The people who are facing this life and death circumstance and that need to find some way to beg, borrow, or steal to come up with a $600,000 to get the cure. Is this a voluntary transaction on their part? One could question that, but Nozick says expressly it is voluntary. And there is an interesting footnote in the book that talks about if there was a notion of human need that was sensible, maybe this would impact this consideration of the chemist and the pricing of the drug. But his orientation is much more oriented around, let's go ahead and reward the chemist for his innovation that brought about this cure, and not penalize him to say, oh, if you have a really good product, you've got to go ahead and sacrifice some of your profitability in order to make that drug more available to people. What is sometimes pointed out with the chemist example is that maybe another way to look at this is to think about the idea that chemists just sort of aren't hatched overnight. They are the result of the larger society investing in schools and institutions that allow people to become chemists and to work in labs. And so that would tend to argue that maybe there is some responsibility to give back to society when they have such a big win like discovering this particular cure. And then the third example is a very extreme example, but it's done to emphasize Nozick's commitment to the issue of liberty and freedom of choice. And he uses this example. What if I, as a person of sound mind, determine that I want to voluntarily place myself in lifetime servitude to another individual? For all intents and purposes, I will be a slave to someone else. They will be able to determine everything that I can do, my future prospects, whether I live or die is going to be something that's in their hands. I will be property, their property for all intents and purposes. Now, why I might want to do that or why somebody else would want to be a slave owner is not something that Nozick gets into. But just say, for whatever psychological reasons, if it could be vetted that this is really what I want to do, should there be a rule against this kind of voluntary slavery? And Nozick would argue that there should not be a rule against that. Now, this puts Nozick's theory in significant conflict with virtually every other of the ethical theories that we have looked at, particularly the Golden Rule, as well as Kant's categorical imperative second formulation, but certainly Jesus' second great commandment, and also potentially utilitarianism, even though utilitarianism does have this issue with the potential for violation of individual rights. So one of the things that I have alluded to previously was that Nozick doesn't place a big emphasis on human need, but instead the expression of individual liberty. But one could think that, let's say, you go for a long period of time where you don't have violations of the principle of justice in acquisition and the principle of justice in transfer, but you have over time horrible economic inequalities that develop that create great misery, that limit the ability of people to develop as persons, that reduce life expectancy, et cetera, et cetera. What are you going to do in a situation like that? Should individual freedom from restraint be the ultimate good, or should we be thinking about freedom in a more adequate way that encompasses positive freedom, like the development of capabilities that people would have to make them more productive citizens? This is truly an open question with Nozick's entitlement theory, and I think it raises a fundamental problem for this theory and also for libertarianism, and that is the issue of the common good. Why is there not a need to think about the common good of society? Why are we always thinking about who will benefit as individuals? Why don't we embrace a bigger picture that understands the common enterprise that we are about in society and the need to look after the good of the whole as opposed to being so focused on the good of the individual? That is very, very much an open question, I think, for libertarianism. Well, that concludes this two-part series on principles of ethics and justice. Thank you so much for joining me.